So the Volkswagen Passat, one of Volkswagen's larger cars, is certainly aimed at the executive and family markets. So what are the best mods for it? Can you do much to improve the performance and the handling of your Volkswagen Passat? Well, in this video, we're going to flag up the best mods that you can do to your Passat. And we're also going to highlight some that don't make very much difference. And you're pretty much wasting your time if that's the only mod you were planning to do. So what are the best mods for the Volkswagen Passat? Well, you've got to look at two aspects of the car in enhancing its performance. And that's first of all improving the power and the output of the engine. And secondly, we're looking at the handling and improving the way the car actually handles. So by looking at both of those and thinking about your overall aim in your project, you can save yourself a lot of problems further down the line. For example, you don't want a car that's got lots of power but is absolutely undrivable on the road. And you don't want a car that corners really, really well, but doesn't have any performance behind it at all. So you're nowhere near the limits of adhesion when it comes to cornering. So thinking about power mods, now there's lots of different engines that have been fitted to the Passats over the years. Most of the more recent ones have turbochargers. There's great diesel engines and there's great gasoline or petrol engines as well. And they offer a lot of performance just out of the box. But those engines respond really well to remapping. So that's where you get the ECU within the car and reprogram it so it's working to a whole different set of parameters. So the ECU contains a map that tells the engine how to work, how to use the fuel, how much air to dump, when to initiate the spark, and lots of other aspects of the engine depending on what type of engine it is. So by altering those characteristics within the engine, you can make dramatic increases in the performance and the power. So if the only mod you were thinking of doing was a remap, you wouldn't go far wrong. That can make a big difference to the car. I would urge you not to take it too far. If you push the car and the turbo too hard on the remap, you will cause a deterioration in the lifespan of the turbo and excessive wear and tear on the engine. But you should be able to get about 20 to 30% more power on most engines fairly easily just by doing a remap. If you want a bit more power than that, a remap is not enough. You need some other components to be upgraded within the engine. So often you'll find that the fueling starts to become a problem. So when you've started to increase the power significantly, you're burning more fuel, and you've got to make sure that the engine gets enough fuel to match the amount of air that's coming into it. So look at uprating the fuel pump and the injectors. Often they can be swapped out from the higher performance variants within the Volkswagen Group family. So that would include Audi. They've got some fantastic RS models. And even in Volkswagen, you've got the R versions of the cars that have uprated engines and injectors. So if they share an engine and other components with your model, they're probably your first port of call when it goes to looking to an upgrade option for your car. Please drop us a like because that really helps us to get out there, and please let us know in the comments what car you've got, because that'll tell me what models I need to cover in future videos, articles and features on the website as well. So once you've got the fueling there, it's time to think about the turbo. So there's been quite a few decent turbos released by Volkswagen over the years, and generally there's a lower powered version of the car that's around about 140 150 brake horsepower, and then there's a higher powered version that's 170 brake horsepower or 190 or 200. The difference between those two sets of engines is generally the map they use and the turbo. There are a few lower powered engines that are in another bracket. They tend to use the same turbo as the lower powered versions, but they've got less beefy fuel injectors and less beefy components within the engine. So often you need to replace the head bolts and the fuel injection system to take them anywhere near the 150, 160, 170 power levels. But the 140s and 150s can go quite easily to 170, 180, 190 horsepower. And just swapping a turbo from the 170 to the 140 or the 150 can make quite a big difference to the scope that you'll get on your tuning project. The beauty of doing that is the parts are readily available in your local breaker's yard. So there's usually quite a few donor cars around that you can cannibalise and take parts of. But if you want more power, you really need to look at getting a decent aftermarket turbo, and there's lots of hybrid options. So the hybrid turbos use the same standard factory casing as your original turbo, but they replace the internal components. So they might upgrade it to a ball bearing turbo, which spools up much more quickly. And the compressors and the internals may be larger. So they may mill out a little bit of the inside to get these larger intake turbines to fit. But that's the way that you make more power. The shape and the angle and the geometry of those turbines determine really where you start getting the power coming on in the RPM range and where it delivers. So generally speaking, larger turbos produce a lot of top end power. They need quite high RPMs to work. And smaller turbos spool up very, very quickly and deliver a really good burst of power. So for most drivers, the smaller turbo upgrades are generally better suited to everyday driving, because that gives you the power in that band and position you absolutely need it. So whenever you have a turbo compressing air into an engine, you get a big build-up of heat, and the intercooler is basically a radiator that allows the compressed air that's become very hot to be exposed to the flow of air coming into the car from the ambient temperatures around, and that drops the temperature back down. Now that makes quite a significant difference to performance. We've run a few figures and looked at lots of stats. If you look at the screen now, we'll just flash up the significant difference that different engine temperatures make on power. And the basic premise behind this is the fact that colder air carries more oxygen, and you need the oxygen to burn the fuel, whatever fuel it is that you're using. So if you can lower your temperature of the intake charge, it'll carry more oxygen, you'll be able to burn more fuel, and you'll make more power. Now don't think of an intercooler as a mod that adds power to your engine. It's just something there to keep the power levels as they were originally designed. And as the intercooler does its job, it actually starts to get warmer, and we call that heat soak, where the heat builds up inside the intercooler itself. So after a lot of spirited driving, the intercooler will get quite hot, and it will really degrade its ability to cool that intake charge. It's fair to say that most factory cars come with very limited intercoolers. The capacity within them is barely adequate for your everyday driving. There's normally a very good argument for fitting an uprated intercooler to the factory one. It's normally much larger in size, the aftermarket ones, and they're best mounted at the front, which sometimes requires a little bit of modification to the front bumper just to make it all fit. But they sit down there quite tidily in front of the radiator in most different models. So it's certainly something worth thinking about. And if you don't do lots of spirited driving and you're not heating the intercooler up, you don't really need an aftermarket intercooler. But if you've added a bigger turbo, there's a lot more compression going on. It certainly makes sense to uprate the intercooler. And there's quite a few aftermarket options around that work really, really well. Certainly a lot better than the factory standard ones. And even within model ranges, you'll find that the performance models sometimes come with better intercoolers than the lower performance ones. So coming on to some more complex mods, we should start to think about the clutch. We typically see those slipping when you've hiked your power by about 30 to 40%. It depends a lot on model to model and how well the car's been looked after and what the condition of the clutch is. But basically, if your clutch is starting to near the end of its life, remapping it, changing the turbo, it's just enough to push it over the edge. So we would certainly recommend getting an up-rated clutch. We've got videos dealing with clutches, and I did go too severe with one of my cars and had lots of problems with the clutch. It was just too heavy in operation. It broke no end of clutch cables, and I wish I'd just chosen a more sensible midway option between the full race spec and a road clutch. And there are options out there. So if you're messing around with the clutch, you may as well think about the flywheel as well. So changing the flywheel, that great big mass that sits between the engine and the clutch and the transmission, and it stores the kinetic energy from the engine as it rotates. So making that a little bit lighter will just make the car rev more freely. It doesn't particularly add power, it reduces weight overall. But coming into the engine itself, we start to look at making the engine a lot more efficient. You want to get the engine burning more air and fuel. The better the engine is at burning the air and fuel mix, the more power you will make. So enlarging the valves, doing work on the head, making sure that the air channels flow nicely into each of the cylinders can make quite a big difference. So changing out the valves for larger valves is another way. You obviously need to enlarge the ports that those valves go into, but there are a few big valve conversion kits around. So other options we're just going to flag up that people may not necessarily have thought about are things like tuning boxes. Now, they get a bad press because there's so many bad units out there that do little more than just dump extra fuel into the engine. But there are a few decent tuning boxes that act more like a piggyback ECU. So the interface between the sensors on your engine's ECU and the sensors on the engine, they lie about air temperatures, fuel, RPMs, and they recalculate what's needed and just make sure everything is running within a tighter set of parameters. A tuning box can often make significantly more power, not usually as much as you would get with a bespoke custom rolling road remap, but it's an easy way of just plugging something into the car and getting a lot more power out of it. So the only other engine mod I would really recommend considering on most of the engines is upgrading the camshaft. So changing the profile of the cam will alter the intake and the exhaust durations on the valves on the engine, and by using that along with the map and all the other mods that you've done, it allows you to make much higher power levels. But be careful with cams. If you go too aggressive, you'll suffer from a very lumpy tick over and idle. So I would just say to most people watching this video, just get a fast road cam fitted in your engine. Now, diesels are not as well suited, generally speaking, to fast road cams because they operate in a much lower RPM range, and with cams you tend to get the power in the top end of the RPM range. So the greater your rev range is, the more benefit you will get from a cam. So a lot of people ask us about intake mods and exhaust mods and whether they add power or not. I have to say and be honest that they will add power, but they won't add significant power. In fact, I would challenge most drivers to actually notice a difference if all they've done is added an induction kit or a sports exhaust. Those mods on their own do not do very much. They just are there to remove a restriction in either the intake or the exhaust. And on a stock engine, there is no restriction. It's been set up to flow more than adequately well from the factory. In fact, with a remap, you're still not pushing the envelope hard enough to experience a restriction in the intake or the exhaust on most models that are out there. When you've tuned the engine and you're making substantially more power, then it's time to look at the intake and the exhaust. Now, in the exhaust, the typical restriction in the flow is nearly always around the catalysts that take out all of the harmful output from the exhaust and turn it into something a little less toxic. So fitting a high flow sports catalyst, if it's legal to do so in your area, will certainly go a long way to removing that typical restriction in the system. But I have to note that if you take the cat out completely, you won't see much more power than you would if you got a sports cat. So there really is no point making your car illegal and having to sort out the engine complaining about the lack of a catalyst and getting it mapped and sorted out correctly. You may just as well fit a sports catalyst that flows much better and get the best of both worlds. You've got a car that is street legal in pretty much every country, and you're not having to mess around with the ECU and with the engine setup too much because you've removed something that the ECU is expecting to be there. So that's addressed the power and the performance of the actual engine. So what about the handling? The stock setup is not great on most Passats. The sporty models tend to have very, very firm suspension. But if you get a decent set of coilovers, that will allow you to adjust the ride height to suit your driving style. And bear in mind, as the car gets lowered, you're affecting the angle and the geometry of the wheel alignment, particularly the dynamic alignment as the car's cornering, because the body will roll and everything will flex and bend and the angle of the wheels will change accordingly. And they've set that up okay from the factory, but it certainly can be improved on. But if you subscribe to the mantra of hard suspension and as low as possible, you're going to wreck that original setup and that original design. So that's a bit of a myth, going as low as you can and as hard as you can. But getting the right suspension, and particularly paying attention to the camber of the wheels, particularly at the front, and the toe angle, can make a dramatic difference to the cornering ability of your Passat. And it's certainly something that's worth thinking about. They're quite large cars, but they can handle like much smaller ones if you get the suspension set up correct and get everything dialed in just right. So making the car go faster, that's one aspect of tuning, but you want to stop it. So you've certainly got to think about your Passat's brakes and upgrading those. Now, just fitting a set of decent pads will make a big difference to the braking of your Passat. Avoid race spec pads because they tend to operate at very high temperatures, and they don't generally bite as well at low, cold road temperatures that most drivers will experience. They're also noisier and they're not that well suited for everyday driving. But there's a big range of performance pads out there that are certainly much better than the stock factory ones, and certainly avoid the cheap pads that some people buy in the aftermarket. It's a false economy. If you're trying to save money on your brake pads, it's a major component. If you really want to make your braking more beefy, then there's no substitute to getting larger brake discs. Within the Volkswagen Audi group, there's lots of options that you can just pretty much swap in. You've just got to check the hub sizes and that they fit. But your local breakers yard is a great source of donor parts. So looking for a performance model set of brakes and just checking they'll fit on yours can make quite a cheap and very decent brake upgrade option for you. So moving out a little bit from the brakes now, we come to the rims. And in my experience, you want to avoid the really big alloy wheels. They're large, they're heavy, you're adding unsprung weight to each corner of your car, and that also affects the gearing of the car to some extent. So those large alloy wheels, although they will on paper perform better in the dry, for most drivers on rough road surfaces and in wet driving conditions, you're much better off sticking with your standard set of alloy wheels, or the standard sizes, or maybe even dropping down an inch or so just to get the maximum benefit from the performance and the handling. So I'd challenge you to give it a go. Try smaller alloy wheels and different profile tyres and just see how that affects the handling. And I'm sure, like me, you'll start to appreciate the improvements that you get and the additional benefits that a smaller, lighter alloy wheel and slightly higher profile tyre will actually give you in your day-to-day driving. But if your car's track focused, then you work into a whole different set of rules. So it makes sense then to go for the larger alloy wheel and the low profile tyre, making sure the tyre is slightly wider and getting a tread pattern that is conducive to improving your cornering and handling, depending on whatever use you're putting the car to. We love people's feedback. We love hearing what you've done to your car. If you disagree with me, please let me know. Please drop in the comments what you think about some of the mods that we've highlighted or we're going to highlight in this video. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. We'd love you to stay tuned and keep up with all of the features that we've got coming out. We've got lots more in-depth articles that cover the Passat and the Passat engines, very specific tuning guides. So we really want to help you get the most performance from your car. And please drop us a like, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.